to get going. I hate to keep people waiting. So we will start. Welcome to Sausalito Books by the Bay virtual happy hour event series. I hope everyone has their adult beverage of choice or some sort of beverage so we can toast the author who's with us this evening. I'm Cheryl Pop, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. We are delighted to be hosting this evening local author Bill Zarchy, who has just published. Well, it hasn't just published. It was a historic moment yesterday. He hit the 1K mark. Finding George Washington, a time travel tale, has now sold 1,000 copies as of yesterday, I believe. So congratulations. We are going to hear all about his debut novel. Bill started out as a cinematographer, and he then put pen to paper instead of doing everything from behind a lens. He is going to be in conversation with one of my favorite impresarios, Mr. Matthew Felix, who is himself an author, a publisher, a podcaster, whom you may be familiar with. And he actually edited and published Bill's book, so he's very familiar with it. And the two of them are going to provide you with I promise you, a very highly entertaining program this evening. So thanks again to all of you for joining us. At the end of the program, there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You probably all know where the Q&A box is, or the chat box, or you can raise your hand. We'll be fielding questions. We'll be sure to allow time for that. So again, thank you all for joining Sausalito Books by the Bay and our happy hour event series. I am now passing the baton to Mr. Matthew Felix. I'm going to sort of
I caught it.
Mute myself and disappear. Okay.
Oh, don't disappear. Don't disappear.
No, I'm not. I'm going to stay.
Okay. All right.
Don't worry. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Cheryl. We're really excited to be here, really excited to do this event, and appreciate you hosting us this evening. And like you said, I hope everyone's got their adult beverage of choice. And I hope that this is an entertaining event. I'm really excited. I loved editing this book and publishing this book. I didn't know what to expect. I don't read a lot of sci-fi. I hadn't done time travel for a long time. And Bill said, can you edit this? I said, sure. And as I got into it, I just started laughing. And then, there was a lot of humor that I hadn't expected. He did a lot of research, which I'm going to ask him about, that was really interesting as well. I'm not a baseball fan. Baseball is a huge part of this book, and I'm much more of a fan now than I was before. And like I said, we're going to talk about all that. But let me tell you a little bit more about Bill for those of you who might not know. Cheryl just mentioned that he was a cinematographer for, how long was that? 40 years. And he wrote about his experiences as a cinematographer on 6 continents, and I forget how many countries, lots and lots of countries, in Showdown at Shinagawa, Tales of Filming from Bombay to Brazil. So that's another one you might want to check out. And of course, you can get through Sausalito Books by the Bay. His Tales from the Road, personal essays, and technical articles have also appeared in Traveler's Tales and Chicken Soup for the Soul anthologies, San Francisco Chronicle, other newspapers, and trade publications such as American Cinematographer, Emmy, and others. He's also, and this is something I suspect he'll be doing again as we move out of the pandemic, knock on wood, he is a graduate of the Epic Storytelling Program at Stagebridge in Oakland. And I've had the chance to see him do his, we've got some Stagebridge in the house there. Yep, Eleanor. And I've had the chance to see him perform at least twice, maybe even more than that. And I look forward to him getting back on stage doing the storytelling. So, but coming full circle, Finding George Washington, a time travel tale, is his first novel. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Finding George, in addition to some of the milestones we already talked about, not the least of which being the 1,000 copies sold, it's gotten a lot of praise. So far we've got over 100, favorable reviews on that website that I won't name. And I want to just touch on, or just cite something that Publishers Weekly's Book Life Prize said about the book, because it really kind of touches on all the different aspects of the novel. Quote, the book is, quote, sprawling and suspenseful. Zarchy takes full advantage of the premise's opportunities for poignancy and hilarity. His crisp prose shines from the get-go as he manages to map a sophisticated tale of time travel with significant tension and memorable characters. This alluring mix of time travel, American history, and baseball will rope in readers of socio-political thrillers. And so there's a lot going on there because there's a lot going on in the book, but I just thought that quote really captures a lot of the key elements. I just want to put in one more plug. I mean, hopefully by the end of this hour, this highly entertaining hour, I'm going to mute somebody. Let's see. I think I'm going to mute. All right. Hopefully by the end of this, what we're hoping will be a highly entertaining hour, you'll be so sold on the book if you haven't already that, again, I just want to plug sausalitobooksbythebay.com. Cheryl will be very happy to sell you a book off of that website. Okay. Without further ado, let's turn to the star of the show. And I don't mean George Washington. I mean Bill Zarchy. Bill, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Cheryl and Sausalito Books by the Bay for hosting us tonight.
It is great to be here. So let's just jump in. And can you tell us what the book's about? I mean, again, I've touched on some of the main themes, but in your words, how do you describe the book when somebody asks you what it's about?
Well, I never really thought of it as science fiction. I mean, it is because it needs a genre, it needs a place to land. But
Right.
I think of science fiction as travel to the stars or squiggly invaders who burrow themselves under your skin or disgusting things like that.
Mm-hmm.
The idea came to me when I was a kid, and it wasn't really a book idea, but when I was a kid, I used to think, as I learned about the wonders of technology in mid-century, trains and planes and cars and rocket ships, and how would I explain this to George Washington? And the thing about Washington is he's a figure from way, way in the distant past, from several centuries back. We know a lot more about the subsequent presidents. We've seen actual photographs of Lincoln. We don't really have a clear idea of what George looked like except for paintings. But the premise of the book is that George Washington disappears from the winter encampment at Valley Forge during the Revolution on a very cold winter's night in 1778, and he's whisked away and somehow turns up at a dog park on San Francisco Bay in the summer of 2014. Now here he meets a young guy from Berkeley, mid-20s, guy named Tim. Tim brings him home, feels sorry for him, doesn't really believe who he is. But here's a guy who looks, kind of down on his luck. Tim saw him jumping from a freight train. He's kind of dirty. Tim brings him home, introduces him to his best friend, Matt. And pretty soon, as they're hosting George and trying to figure out who he is and what to do with him if he really is George Washington, consequences happen. Things start to change in their world, and they start to wonder about that. And they start to think that, they start to wonder what would happen to the history of the world? What will happen to the history of the world if George Washington doesn't get back to Valley Forge? Will the colonials defeat the British? And will all the subsequent wars of liberation, starting with the French Revolution on down, will they happen without the inspiration of the American Revolution?
Right, right.
Tim and Matt are also big baseball fans, and George starts watching baseball with them, and that becomes a theme and more of a metaphor for the story.
All right, well, hold off on that because we're definitely going to talk about baseball.
Okay.
But tell me specifically though, why George? Right, there are so many figures from the past. You said as a kid, it sounds like you were already specifically interested in George versus maybe some of the other founding fathers or other figures from history. So, what is it about George specifically that you've found interesting?
Well, the fact that a couple of things that I mentioned. One, I mean, it's hard to know what he looked like. I found early pictures of George, which we'll get into a little later, where he looks quite different from how he does in this little work of art, which is one of the most reproduced works of art in the history of the world. There are billions and billions. Imagine painting a picture and having it reproduced billions of times. And in the early years, and that's the part of George that I'm most interested in. He was a young, vigorous man. In this picture, it looks like he's got a face made of marble, and of course he is very stiffly sitting for a portrait artist. So I just thought. The other thing I realized when I was very young was that, especially before Kennedy was president, every president of the United States had spent at least part of their lives in the 1800s. George died in 1799. So that was pre-technology. That was before the cotton gin. It was before railroads, there were early experiments with steam engines at that point, but nothing like a locomotive. Um, and he literally existed, spent his whole life in the horse and buggy days. To get from Mount Vernon to Philadelphia took days and days and days in a carriage, or even more uncomfortably on horseback, although he did do many of those trips on horseback. And that's what intrigued me about him was uh, the things that I thought I knew about him. He had wooden teeth. That's not true. He chopped down a cherry tree when he was 10 years old, but he couldn't tell a lie to his father. Not true. He threw a silver dollar across the Potomac. The Potomac's about a mile wide at Mount Vernon. No way any of that happened. And I realized just how little I knew about him, and that intrigued me as I got more and more into this story.
I just feel so disillusioned now. I thought all of that was true. I'd forgotten. I think after I edited the book and read the book, I think I let all of those truths that I learned insofar as that stuff not being truth I think I went back into denial, and now you've just brought me back out. And it's, especially the cherry tree thing and the lion
He did
thing.
wear a 3-cornered hat though.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't even know if they had cherry trees at Mount Vernon. And his father actually died when George was 11 years old. So a lot of those tales were made up after George died by a pastor named Pastor Weems, who wrote a heroic book about Washington and made up all of that stuff. The wooden teeth thing is not true, but the teeth that he did have, which were made from rhinoceros bone and whale bone, and in some cases human teeth possibly bought from slaves, those teeth did turn brown over the years, but they were not made of wood. But the color is what led to that odd belief.
Right. I love that all of those myths basically came from that same person, and over time they just became accepted as truth. But let's go back to a comment you made a second ago about technology and how, as you were a kid and you would come across new technology, you would think, well, I wonder how George Washington would sort of process this. That's a big part of the book, and that's where a lot of the humor comes from in the book. And like I said, you did it really well, because I was kind of wondering, it would be easy in this kind of book to kind of go for the easy laughs. And so I was really pleasantly surprised, because like I said, I genuinely found myself laughing out loud repeatedly, because I mean, you just did it really well. So if you could go ahead, you have your first reading, I think, addresses that. And this is the reading related to plumbing. So do you want to go ahead and read that for us?
Yeah. This is a chapter called Plumbing, actually. And in the previous chapter ends, was this fellow, meaning George, was this fellow a magnificent actor who looked a lot like Washington, or was the first president of the United States indeed sitting in my kitchen sipping a can of Miller Lite? The general sat back, bone weary, enjoying the rest. He then examined his drink. Beer, you say? He grinned tightly. Very watery, isn't it? We quickly ran out of things to say. He marveled at the cans. Such bright, beautiful metal. They appear to be made of gold and silver. Not. After a while, inevitability reared its ugly head. Young man, please call me Tim, General. Timothy, could you kindly direct me to the privy? Sure, but I'd better show you how to use it. It's all changed since your day. That won't be necessary. Well, there are plumbing devices to learn. Plumbing? I took him on a tour of the bathroom. I was sure that even in wartime, the general had always washed from a basin filled with warm water by servants, slaves. He had probably never seen running water in a sink, much less a shower. At the basin, he gleefully grasped the left lever and twisted, then stuck his hand under the tap. Oh my, it's warm. No, it's hot. Who heats this water and puts it into this pipe? The water comes from a tank where it's kept hot by burning a fuel. Here's where you sit, General. I showed him how to lift the lid and the seat, and I mentioned the protocol of closing the seat after use. He eyed the toilet suspiciously. And this magic lever on the side blows water through and makes it all go away, I added. Where? Where what? Where does it go? Just away. Is it magic, Timothy, like the cold box? No, sir, just technology. Eh? Invention, science. He was curious, yet his shoulders slumped with each new revelation, his apparent displacement in time and space beginning to weigh on him. He needed help. He looked at me with a tight smile. I fear I must rest. I hate to impose, but is there somewhere I could lay my weary head? I smiled. I know just the place. And perhaps something to wear that is a bit less formal than my current attire? He looked down at his high boots and wartime clothing. He ends up in Tim's sister's bed wearing a Hello Kitty shirt and surrounded by Beanie Babies. Tim's
No
sister was away in
spoilers.
college, right?
No
The
spoilers,
sister's
Bill.
away in college.
That was a huge giveaway of the plot. But yeah,
Oh,
Hello
no.
Kitty. Hello Kitty, by the way, was a really, really nice touch. So I like to talk about craft, being a writer, and I know that we have a few writers on, and I'm sure Cheryl appreciates that as well. So one craft question I had for you as I was preparing for today is, I remember early on in the process, you said something along the lines of, you weren't sure when you started writing the book, you weren't actually sure where it was going to go. And so I'm just curious if you could tell us just a little bit about how the story evolved and how you ended up with, a sort of cohesive arc that, in the end makes a lot of sense. And, some people use outlines, some people don't. So I'm just curious kind of about your process for developing the plot.
Well, I had heard that a lot, and I'd read a lot about writing, and I'd been in a writers group for many years. And one of the things that you read about writing is, especially with fiction, is you have to know where the story is going to go. You have to have an outline. How can you write a plot? How can you develop a story if you don't know where it's going to go? And I thought, I don't know where this is going to go. All I have is a notion. And I'd started to write, and I had a few chapters, and it kept bugging me. And then I read Stephen King's book on writing, which is called On Writing. And in there, he said he never knows where his stories are going to go. He starts with characters and a situation, and he starts writing whatever he sees, whatever chapters he sees, and from there he lets it develop. And he said once he gets the characters going in the situation, uh, they take him wherever they're going to take him. And I thought, if it's good enough for Stephen King, it's good enough for me. I
Yeah.
didn't know where it was going to go. I had an idea that I wanted to get him back to his own time, and I wasn't sure whether I was going to get him in the original story, the original concept, such as it was, which was about a half a page of prose on a sheet. I wasn't sure if I was going to take him back to Valley Forge, or if we were going to find one of those portals, time travel portals. Matthew, I'm sure you have one right outside your house.
Actually, no, it's in the living room. I've got one.
In the living room, right? That's how you
Yep.
got here, from 1778.
That's
Matthew
it.
actually is George Washington incarnate. But I wasn't sure where I was going to take him, or how I was going to do. But I knew I kept writing and developing more chapters, and then I made a critical decision at one point that I wasn't going to take my characters anywhere where I hadn't been, and so I ended up taking a long train trip. I ended up going to all the places mentioned in the book. I ended up doing research at a couple of different baseball ballparks, one of which I've been to 1,000 times, and the other just once. That was how the story developed.
Were there
The,
any?
the, other, the other thing I want to say about that is that I'd been looking for an agent for a long time before I decided to do independent publishing, and in the course of that, that was kind of a fruitless search. And when I came back to the book, after looking for an agent for on and off for several years, I'd done only minimal work on the book. It was 2020, and racism was on everybody's mind, and I thought, how am I going to deal with the concept of slavery? And I reread the book, wondering, he's got a question.
No, I'm saying don't say too much about slavery, because we're gonna talk
Okay,
about that.
I'll hold on that. Go
Yeah.
for it.
Okay. Well, the other follow-up question I was just going to ask you about process and kind of how you ended up is just, you mentioned that you kind of let your characters take you where they were going to take you. Is there any place they took you that was surprising, or what was the most surprising twist, or again, place they took you that you might not have anticipated? Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, on the train trip, I took Amtrak, and I got a sleeper compartment. And if you get a sleeper compartment, you get all your meals free in the dining car. And I assumed it would be warmed up hamburgers, and actually it was fairly good American food. It was nothing fancy, but they cooked everything to order. There were no powdered eggs. It was pretty good. And they seat you with other people because the tables all hold four. So I met a ton of people in the course of the long train trip. a number of whom turned out to be assassins, villains, and murderers in my book.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh, in your book. Yeah.
I changed all the names and I changed the towns they were from. A friend of mine who's read the book said, "Those people are much too racist to be from Reno." And I looked them up, and it turned out they were from Petaluma. So,
There you go.
but I found a lot of awful people on the train.
Okay,
Some
good,
of
good.
whom were surprisingly nice, but I had them. I don't want to say too much.
Yeah.
They presented as nice.
Yes, they present it as nice, and we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the big premises of the book we've already touched on, but we haven't actually talked about. I mean, it's a time travel tale, right? That's the subtitle, a time travel tale. So tell us a little bit more about why time travel for your first novel.
I never really thought of it as time travel. I mean, I knew I wanted him to be here, but I wasn't sure how to get him here. And I had lunch with a young man, friend of mine, and I said, how do I have him disappear from Valley Forge and travel through time? And he said, well, maybe there can be a magnetic confluence, in Valley Forge on that day. I said, a magnetic confluence, cool. Is that a thing? He said, well, it is if you write it. There's no such thing as a magnetic confluence. I heard of harmonic convergence, 15, 20 years ago. So I thought, well, that's okay, but that doesn't really make any sense to me. And I talked to some other writers and a friend of mine who was an engineer and another friend who was a scientist. And the last two said, don't try to define how the technology works. This guy said, scientists will pick your science apart. Instead, talk about how it's used and what the consequences are. And that was really good advice. And so I don't have dilithium crystals, and I don't have all the other kinds of technology that you see in a lot of time travel stories. I just have this phenomenon. He went through town. He traveled through time, and he had to get out to California some way, and that I did in a totally different way, which I'm not going to give away.
Right. Okay, thanks for that. I love that. Did you find any evidence? Do you think that time travel will eventually be possible?
Yeah, I've been on a bunch of different Facebook time travel groups.
Yes, you
and
have.
there are people there who know all about it and keep saying things like, well, I just arrived here from the year 2322. And let me
Oh.
tell you, things are really great there, or things are really terrible, or how many people here have traveled through time? And 25 people say, I just got here from. So yeah, apparently it's true. If it's on Facebook, it's got to be true.
Yeah, and I guess so. My question was actually, is it going to be possible? And you're saying it already is. So that's really good to know.
Einstein postulated in the theories of relativity that an object of near infinite mass traveling close to the speed of light could theoretically travel through time.
Okay.
But an object of near infinite mass, that's not anything that we're capable of doing, nor is approaching the speed of light.
Right. We're working on it, maybe. I don't know.
We're working on it. And Einstein's plays a little role in the book too.
Yes. And in all seriousness, you did so much research for this book, and including about time travel. I mean, there's some really interesting sort of nuggets that you dug up related to time travel that are really interesting. But rather than touch on those specifics, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to some of the other research you did. And you already alluded to this. One thing that was important to you was an accurate physical representation of Washington at the age that he would have been when he appeared in Berkeley. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And I believe you have something you want to show us that will give us a better idea of some of the different depictions of him at that age.
Yeah, I read it there. I read a couple of really good books about Washington and Washington. One was called In the Painter's Chair. To have your portrait painted, really only very wealthy and very prominent people had their portraits painted. You had to sit for a day or days for an artist who very painstakingly would paint you, and then go back to his studio and make 20 copies of the same painting. So a lot of the historical paintings of Washington exist in many original copies.
Oh, interesting.
But one thing I noticed was, as I said earlier, in this depiction, which this is from the Gilbert Stuart portrait of 1797. George died at age 67 in 1799, so he was 65 here, which for his time was a very old man. He survived many wars and lots of diseases and stuff like that, but he looks very different in the later pictures of him than in the earlier pictures. And part of that is because he had dental problems his whole life. By the time he was inaugurated president in 1789, he had one of his own natural teeth left, and he had artificial teeth for a good part of his life. And because of that, if you've ever lost a significant number of teeth, you also lose jawbone. And so if you look at the earlier pictures of George, he has a much more prominent chin than the later pictures. And some of the pictures look like they're the same guy. I'm going to show you like a short slideshow. Some of them look like these are definitely the same guy, and some of them look like, who's that? They just look like somebody completely different. Either he was having a bad day, or the painters weren't that good. There's a famous story of Rembrandt Peale, the artist, and his father Charles Wilson Peale had George Washington sit for a portrait for both of them on the same day, one directly in front of him and one at a bit of an angle, and they set themselves up so they couldn't see each other's canvases. And the sons, the Rembrandt Peale's, the son's version, George looks really old and tired and haggard, and the father's version, George looks a lot more youthful.
I love that. Interesting.
The picture may be worth 1,000 words, but I don't know how to finish that sentence.
Well, you know what it reminds me of that whole notion that, you get 10 witnesses to a car wreck and everybody tells it totally differently, right? Reality is pretty subjective, I guess.
And here we go. Let me know if you have sound.
All right. Quite a number of depictions there. I think 1795, there was an utter lack of consensus on what George looked like at that age, but really interesting to see the variety of depictions. And there was one where I think, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say there was one where he had that. Oh, I think we have a lag. You go ahead. I'm not saying anything.
Some of those artists had obviously never been in the presence of George Washington. And some of the engravings, the black and white fine grain engravings, were done by artists based on other people's paintings. So there's a lot of kind of second and third generation art there.
Right. There's one where he looked like a little Caesar or something. His hair was really closely cropped. And
yeah, there was a statue of him that was done in a heroic kind of Roman style with bare shoulders and the whole thing. The other bust that's the basis of the 25-cent piece, the quarter, showing him in profile with that strong profile, was done about 10 years before he was president by the French sculptor Houdon, and Martha Washington and the family considered that the best likeness of George, much more than the paintings. Houdon did a life mask, covered Washington's face in plaster, and really did spend several weeks doing a study of him.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you know which one they thought was the most accurate. That's interesting. That helps us to not have to guess or whatever. Okay, so let's change.
And that they thought a lot of them were inaccurate even at that time.
Right. So let's change gears completely and talk about another main thread here. Again, we've already mentioned it once or twice, but we haven't explored it in depth. And that, of course, is baseball. Like I said, I'm not a huge fan, but I really honestly developed.
You are now.
I'm closer to being a huge fan. Oh, there we go. He's got his outfit there. I think Cheryl needs to. Cheryl has something to hold up, right? Cheryl's got something to hold up. She's also brought her.
I want to compliment Bill on his outfit, which is outstanding. I love a book event where costumes are involved. Anyone who knows me knows I'm a costume girl. I love it. So I was conflicted today: red, white, and blue, All-American, George Washington, or my Giants t-shirt. I grew up in the Bay Area, born and raised, so I'm a huge Giants fan. So nice. I opted for the more formal look, which I think is appropriate, General Bill Zarchy, based on your outstanding outfit. But I have to hats.
Yeah, this is actually a hoodie with a print of a sort of a three-dimensional print on it.
I love it.
Which I bought online, and it turns out that Revolutionary War hoodies are made in England. Go figure.
Oh, who knew?
I love it.
Who knew?
All right. Thanks, Cheryl, for that. I just wanted you to get credit for your team spirit. I, of course, have my Giants microphone. That was my contribution.
There you go.
Okay. But tell us about baseball. Tell us why did you decide you wanted to make that, and specifically the San Francisco Giants, such a key part of the story?
Well, I wasn't sure I wanted to at first, and I started the story without that notion. But it kind of seemed like maybe baseball could be a metaphor for the revolution, and I wasn't sure how. I started the book in late in 2013, and by the time the summer of 2014 rolled around, the Giants, the first quarter of the season, were really on a roll. They were having a great season. They were the best team in baseball, and a quarter of the way, and I started to think maybe I can work some of this in. Maybe George meets a baseball fan and becomes a baseball fan, or who knows, and I started to think about that and work that in. And then the second half of the season, the Giants tanked. And for the whole middle part of the season, they were the worst team in baseball. And I was taking my train trip and doing other research, and I thought, well, that was a nice idea, but it's never going to happen. And then toward the end of the season, the Giants improved tremendously. And so their season was like this, and then like this, and then like this again. And toward the end of the season, I began to think, well, what if they won the pennant? What if they even went to the World Series? Well, they didn't end up winning the pennant, but they did get into the playoffs through the wild card. And then, as some of you may remember, the season had an end that was quite surprising for a lot of fans.
Something else that's surprising is after one of the baseball games in the book, there's a suspenseful incident that happens as they're leaving one of the Giants games, and I think that is your next reading. Do you want to share that passage with us?
Yeah, this is from a chapter called Fog. George and Tim and Tim's best friend Matt who's a big part of the story, and Tim's aunt Rachel, who's become a friend of George and lives near to Tim. Um, George has enjoyed. They've all enjoyed watching the Giants together, especially during this roller coaster season. And George pesters them because he really wants to see a game and experience what it's like. He still can't quite understand the dimensions of what's happening. So this is a chapter called Fog. When George and his friends Tim, Matt, and Aunt Rachel arrived at the Giants game in San Francisco, it was sunset on a beautiful evening. But the Giants lost, and the Dodgers clinched first place in the division. And the weather changed. A chill wind greeted us as we left the ballpark, swirling San Francisco's famous fog around us as we hurried toward the car. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees as night fell. Carl Sandburg was wrong. The fog didn't come in on little cat feet, stealthily tiptoeing across the hills. It was only picturesque from afar. When the fog engulfed you, it was like getting hit in the face with a cold, wet mop. Maybe Mark Twain never actually said that the coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco, but summer days often turned cold and foggy, and changes in temperature could be dramatic and sudden. The Giants always played Tony Bennett's I Left My Heart in San Francisco as a victory anthem after home games. Despite tonight's loss, they lost to the Dodgers. I sang a few comforting lines to myself as we walked out into the howling wind. Ironic words for a gloomy night. The mood of the exiting Giants fans matched the angry weather. A few drunks in the crowd started to chant, Giants suck! Giants suck! Other fans booed the drunks half-heartedly, but too many were silent, annoyed that the Giants had tanked all week, losing 5 out of 6 games. Rachel took George's hand as we followed the crowd. I heard someone up ahead of us baiting LA fans who had come to the game in full Dodgers regalia, baiting them in a nasty, personal way, beyond the bounds of good-natured sports rivalry. Someone began to chant, fuck the Dodgers, and a minute later, I heard yelling, the smash of a glass bottle, and running feet. I shuddered. I just wanted to get back to Berkeley. We walked along the foggy Embarcadero, and the disappointed crowd boiled off the sidewalk and into the driving lanes. Traffic slowed, and cars swerved as angry fans jaywalked against a don't walk light. A black sedan careened out of a side street at great speed, headlights off despite the thickening fog, rattled across the tracks onto the Embarcadero, and raced toward a small gap in the swarming crowd just ahead of us. I realized that the sedan was aiming directly for a couple of Dodger fans up ahead, along with George and Rachel. He never saw it, but Rachel spotted the imminent danger, lowered her shoulder, and smashed her diminutive body into George's midsection, just below the word Giants on his jersey. Caught unawares, he toppled over backward out of harm's way, but she somehow stayed on her feet in the path of the car. Bam! The car sideswiped Rachel and spun her like a top. She crumpled to the ground. Bam! The car hit a guy in a Giants jersey. The car hit a guy in a Dodger jersey, then sped away. I tried to read the license plate, but it was too dark in the gloomy night. Someone yelled, call 911! I feared the worst. George and Matt were by Rachel's side. She lay face down on the pavement, the other victim about 10 feet away. My heart was in my throat. Oh my God, I thought. She's dead.
I can't believe you made those of us who have already read the book relive that gripping passage. We wanted to touch on that because, again, a reminder, we've talked about the humor and the history and the time travel and some of the fun, but it is still suspenseful and there is still a big thriller element to the book as well, which I would talk about more, but I'm going to move on to the more serious theme that I stopped you from going too far about earlier, and that of course is slavery, because as you mentioned, Washington owned slaves, and so this is a really tricky time to be sort of celebrating this historical figure who's got this horrible part of their past. So can you tell us more about, first off, two-part question. One is, can you tell us a little bit more about Washington and his relationship with slaves and slavery? And then two, Well, actually, I'm just going to leave it at that for now. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Is there going to be a part two, or should I
There's
spill
going to be
the
a part
beans?
two. There's going to be a part two, but first I'm going to ask you to read before part two. Yeah.
Before the part two.
Before the part two. So for now,
Okay.
Tell us about Washington and his relationship with slavery, please.
George's father died when George was 11 years old, and George inherited 10 slaves at that point as his personal property, which was the law. It was legal in Virginia, and in fact in all the colonies at that time. It was legal in all the colonies during the Revolution. Slavery was still legal. Um, he later inherited Mount Vernon, the estate, and with that came a number of other slaves. Uh, he definitely, in the course of his lifetime, had at least a glimmering awareness that slavery was evil and immoral, and he made an attempt to free his slaves in his will. But I think we want to get to that a little later. Okay, um, and but there were a number of things that happened. There was a regiment in the Battle of Rhode Island. The First Rhode Island Regiment was all black, all free black men, and they fought very valiantly during the Revolution, and that gave George some pause. The in the beginning of the Revolution, the Virginia militia would not accept black soldiers under any conditions, but some of the other colonies did, especially free blacks. And then when the British came in and landed many troops, they started to put out the word that any slaves who left their masters would be granted citizenship in Britain, and could, as long as they served in the English army against the slave owning colonials. And that was a big draw, and that probably led to a bit of George's change of tune about all that.
Yep. So go ahead and read the excerpt about slavery, if you would.
This is from a chat. I'm a little stuffed up, pardon me, from allergies, so some of these words are a little difficult. Let me make sure I've got the right part. Yeah. The name of the chapter is Manumission, Manumission. Manumission. Tim and Matt and George are discussing slavery. George looked crestfallen. We're doing the best we can. And I should mention that Matt, Tim is the narrator of the story. Matt is his best friend, and Matt is African American and has been giving George a lot of grief about being a slave owner. George looked crestfallen. We're doing the best we can. A flawed early union with the united strength and will to break away from the British is better than a group of separate colonies divided over slavery. What would you have us do? Free the slaves, said Matt. All of them? Complete manumission? What's that? Complete emancipation. Yes, General, that's what should happen. That will never do, George said. Freeing all the slaves would leave Mount Vernon without a labor force and leave the Washingtons very poor indeed, land poor. And there are other concerns. It's not a simple problem. If I were to free my slaves, what would they do? Where would they go? They have no education, no training. Then build them schools, give them jobs and homes. They have jobs and homes now, but not their liberty. They yearn for their freedom from you, the same way you and Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton pined to be free of England and King George. That stopped the conversation for a while, putting the plight of his slaves on the same ground as his own struggle against the mother country seemed to be something George had not allowed himself to consider. In your army, this is Matt continuing, in your army, there are slaves who fight for the freedom of the colonies, yet remain enslaved. Don't you see the massive moral contradiction in that, sir? Silence. Then a slow response. More and more I do, especially for men of African descent with whom I am personally acquainted. Billy Lee, for one. Who's that? My manservant, who has accompanied me through all the travails of the Revolution thus far, until my diversion into your century, that is. Billy Lee's service to me has been exemplary. Your manservant is a slave, and you brought him north to New England, New York, and Pennsylvania to serve you during the War for Independence? Yes. Isn't that immoral, or at least illegal? Isn't he fighting for his freedom alongside you? Why is he not a free man if he's left the South and resides in the North, even if it is in a war zone? Please remember, Matthew, that in my time, slavery is legal in all the colonies, but immoral everywhere. George pressed his lips together and knotted up the ridge between his eyebrows. He looked composed but troubled. Finally, he answered, "Yes, Matthew, I'm beginning to understand."
Thank you for that. Excuse
And
me. And so, go ahead.
the character was not named after you, by the way.
That's not what you told me when you asked me whether I would edit this or not. That's interesting. Okay, we'll talk about that later. But so that the part two that I almost asked you before the reading and decided to hold off on is, well, let me preface the part two by saying that what I liked about your handling of this is you didn't oversimplify it. You didn't sugarcoat it. You didn't suddenly have George have this epiphany, right? Racism, or slavery is wrong, and I'm going to change that when I go back. You did have a conversation about it, right? And you did show, as we saw in that excerpt, he's sort of going in that direction. But again, you didn't oversimplify it. So can you tell us? I would be nervous to write that sort of thing, particularly given the time we're in, particularly not being African American. So can you tell us kind of when you decided to broach that subject, the concerns you had and how you navigated that so that you felt like you were doing an okay job and were comfortable sharing it?
Well, when I came back to the book after not having really looked at it for about a year, as I mentioned, it was 2020, the year 2020, and racism was on everybody's mind, and I started to think, well, what am I going to do? I mean, if I go back to the book, what am I going to do about slavery?
Mm-hmm.
We can't sugarcoat it. I'd already established that one of the characters was African American in order to be a foil for that whole political dialogue. Um, and I reread the book, and I realized I hadn't sugarcoated it. I had Matt confronted him in a pretty honest way, and they had some really good talks about it. Uh, at no point does George say as he said, "You're right, I'll change my ways," because so much depended on him and on uh, the way the system was set up. There were 300 when George and Martha, when George left the presidency and George and Martha retired to Mount Vernon, there were 300 slaves on the plantation, and several years later, when George died, in his will, he attempted to free the slaves, and he's very famous for being the only one of the founding fathers. All the founding fathers, at one time or another, including the Northerners, owned slaves. The northern people, the Hamiltons and the Adamses, had very few slaves and very early in their lives. But it was a way of life in Virginia. It was illegal for a slave owner to free his slaves in Virginia until quite a time after the Revolution. Um, and the other complication was that Martha Washington had been married once before George. She was widowed, and her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, he died very suddenly, and he died without a will. And under the laws of the state of Virginia, his estate had to be kept intact for his heirs. Now, he left two children, and George eventually adopted them, so it didn't really matter. But George could administer the estate, but he couldn't sell off the assets. And so on Mount Vernon, among the 300 slaves, you had about 100 who belonged directly to George. You had about 100 that had come, they were called the dower slaves, that had come from the estate of Martha's first husband. And then the other third were enslaved people who were the product of intermarriage among those two groups. So George couldn't free more than a fraction of his slaves. Nevertheless, he did.
Yeah.
And he also feared what would happen to the remaining slaves after he died, because he was very suspicious of his family. As well he might be, because after he died, the slaves that belonged to Martha were divided up, families split up, and all the horrors of slavery you can imagine among Martha's relatives.
So
tragic ending.
Yeah, and there's so much there. I mean, I'm sure we could do a whole series, obviously, just on that aspect of the novel. But in the interest of time, so thank you for that. But in the interest of time, we've got 10 minutes left. And so if anyone in the audience has questions, I want to open it up for questions now. And if you don't, I always have more questions in my back pocket, but I want to at least extend the opportunity to anyone. You can do it, via the chat. And I think Cheryl explained this, but if you go to the bottom of your screen, just in case anyone doesn't know, If you go to the bottom of your screen, hover over the bottom, you'll see the icons will appear. Click on chat. The chat window opens on the lower right of your screen, and you can type some questions in there if anyone has any. And so I'll wait a second to see, or you can also wave. And Cheryl, do I see you talking? Yeah, I see your lips moving.
Right. We can unmute you. You can wave, you can chat, you can let us know you want to speak. But I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
You mentioned, Bill, you mentioned Stephen King and his book on writing, which is an excellent resource. He also wrote a book about time travel, and I'm wondering if that inspired you or gave you this idea. And it was about the JFK assassination. I think the book was called 22/11/63.
11/22/63.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I forget. Yeah, I forget exactly the title, but it was, yeah, was that infamous day in November
Right.
in
Right.
1963. And part of the book, if for those of you who haven't read it, is, what if it hadn't happened? What if things had been different? And were you familiar with that book because of your
Yeah.
fondness for
I read.
Stephen King?
I beat him to the punch. I started writing before he did. His book came out 11/22/63 came out, I would guess 2 or 3 years ago. It might have been longer ago than that, and I
Well,
read it voraciously. And there's also a mini series based on it, which I watched, and I think it's very good. Um, One of the things that I picked up from it is that the consequences of time travel, whether you believe it's true or not, it's still a great narrative device. The consequences of time travel are often not what you think they're going to be, and
yes.
that's what happens in the Stephen King book. And
Yeah.
the idea is, wouldn't it be great if I could just stop Lee Harvey Oswald from pulling the trigger or whatever?
Mhm.
But that that isn't necessarily the case. It is, and that was very inspiring to me. I
Well,
also got in. Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I think like Stephen King, I'm sure you don't mind being compared to him. I think you did a good job getting people to suspend. I mean, I'm not a big sci-fi reader. I'm sort of into, I love romance, but I also like reality. And Stephen King and you both really, even though it's this whole time travel thing to me is very far-fetched, when a book is written well, you suspend that disbelief and you get wrapped up in it, and you're totally believing that this could happen. And I think that's one of the things you do very well in this book.
Thank you. Thank you. I also got inspiration from the Back to the Future film series, which had some wonderful kind of new notions about time travel from early sources like The Time Machine by H.G. Wells and A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, which I never thought of as time travel, but of course it is.
Mhm.
Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court,
Yep.
the Mark
Yep.
Twain novel. And there are many things that contributed to it. And I don't know if I believe that it's a scientific possibility, but I think it's certainly a great narrative device.
It's a great narrative. Okay, we have
Thank you.
one question. You may have seen this as well, but how did you get your agent and publisher?
I didn't have an agent. I still don't have an agent. I My dad was a writer. My dad wrote and published over 30 books on crafts and hobbies in the outdoors, and that was his avocation. He was a high school teacher, and somehow fit in the time to do that. And when I was planning, after my dad died, when I was planning to publish my first book, to self-publish my first book, my mother said to me, "You should get an agent, Bill, because Pop would have done much better if he'd only had an agent." And I queried dozens of agents and then dozens more, sending a query letter, sending sample pages, and then dozens more over a period of several years. And I got to the point last summer where I was talking with a friend who works in the publishing business. And I said, "Is anybody publishing books in the pandemic? Is it worth trying to continue to find an agent?" He said, "Well, Bill, how many agents have you queried?" And I said, "Over 100." He said, "Over 100." I said, "Well, over 130." He said, Bill, there's a fine line between delusion and persistence. I find that in my own work." And I thought, okay, I think I'm on the delusion side here. So he said, "Why don't you self-publish it? You've done it before," which I did with my first book. And it's easier now and cheaper. I don't know if it's easier and cheaper now, but it certainly was a possibility. And I thought, And he said, if you get an agent tomorrow, there's no guarantee you'll ever see a book. And even if there is, it'll take a year or two or three. If you self-publish, you can have a book in your hand in a month, which was a lie, but 2 or 3 months later, it was there. And I didn't want to do it alone. And that's when I saw a Facebook post from Matthew, who I've known for several years, is a wonderful author. And I knew he'd published several of his own books and a number of books for other people. And I enlisted his help as someone who knew a lot more about it. And somebody once told me, always hire people who know more than you do. And I thought that was the case with Matthew. So I never got an agent. I never got a publisher. I went through the self-publishing process.
There you go. Any questions? Anybody else have any questions?
I see one in a direct message from Stu Zuckerman, who I went to college and grad school with. Hi, Stu. Stu says, "How did you work he sent it as a private message to me. How did you work as a cinematographer enhance your ability to visualize your fiction writing?" That's a good question. One thing it did, I mean, just being a visually oriented person, is when I noticed all the stuff I was talking about what did George Washington look like, and I suddenly had the realization. Of course, we've never seen a photograph of him. Another thing is that in visualizing the train trip and the action sequences, I think just having a visual sense was very helpful for all of that. Um, I those are the main ways that it influenced me. And the one of the reviewers who reviewed the book for on the Daily Kos commented that the chapters are very short. And a number of people have complimented me on having short chapters. My daughter-in-law said, I fall asleep so quickly every night, and if you have short chapters, I feel like I'm making some progress. So that's a good tip for writers. Short chapters make people happy. But the reviewers said that short chapters were good because it gave it a cinematic feeling. It feels like here's a scene, here's a scene, here's a scene. And I also date stamped all the scenes because all the history background, all the historical background in the book is accurate, as is the baseball background. So the teams in the various Giants games and in the playoffs in 2014, everything that happens in baseball in the book is accurate and actually happened on that day, with one exception, which is in the author's note.
It's historical fiction.
Historical fiction.
And
I call it, I just want to say that it's tough to figure out what the genre is, and in entering a couple of contests and other things like that, I usually pick sci-fi. I call it a fine sci-fi blend with notes of alternate history, baseball saga, and action thriller.
There you go. I think that works. I think that works. I want to let people know too, if you haven't seen the book yet, obviously we'd be happy to sell you a copy. We have it in the store. We ship anywhere in the US for free. If there's someone else you'd like to send it to, you can call us or email us. I provided that information in the chat. And one of the things I liked in the back of the book is that there's a book list of recommended reading and basically, I think, resources that Bill used, because there was a lot of interesting information that, as Matthew said, you didn't know about George Washington, you didn't know, well, particularly a lot of the history. So it's a very delightful read, a very entertaining read. And I guess I have one last, here, there's another question maybe. Oh, somebody said, and also some magical realism. Yes, that would also be part of the book, I think. My last question for Bill is, what inspired you to go from cinematography to writing? They always say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but you have opted to go into words. And I think obviously it did help frame your ability to, create images with words because you had that visual gift. But was there something that triggered, and do you still do photography, or did you set the camera aside for a pen?
I still do still photography, but I haven't done anything with motion other than on my iPhone for the 6 years since I retired. I feel like I've always been another writer. I've always been a writer. My dad, the writer, gave me an ancient portable typewriter when I was 10 years old, and I taught myself to type like this. And I quickly extorted a quarter out of many of my relatives for the family news journal newspaper that I was going to produce, which probably never went more than one copy. And there was things like, my sister Sue is reading a book on blah, blah, blah. Maybe one set. Anyway, I worked for the newspaper in high school. I was managing editor of the daily newspaper when I was in college. And when I got to film school, I went to grad school in film at Stanford, which is where I met my wife, Susan, who's here. When I got there, I realized that making films was an amalgam of writing and photography and things I'd been interested in for both of I've been interested in for a long time. I joined a writers group about 20 years ago because I was having interesting experiences with my cinematography because I was working often for corporate clients and traveling abroad quite a bit. I realized that the product, the films that I was generating, and I was the cinematographer. I wasn't the producer or the writer or anything like that. I was just doing the visual side. But the products of those trips were not reflected in the experience of being there and doing it wasn't reflected in the product. So I could go to France and shoot a famous cancer doctor and make a really cool film about these new procedures he's doing. But the experience of being there and working with a French crew and dealing with the food and dealing with the logistics were often funny and could be quite interesting. And so I started writing that kind of stuff. And that's when this book came up, Showdown in Shinagawa. And thank you for mentioning it. And that was my first book and about those kinds of experiences. And I workshopped a lot of those stories in the writers group. But as I got closer to retirement, I noticed that people around me in the writers group were moving from short pieces to full-length fiction. A lot of people were writing novels, and that became really intriguing because I was starting to think, what am I going to write after I retire? And I stopped generating cute stories about, eating gelato in Japan with a lighting crew and things like that. And so I started looking around for a subject, and this old idea about George Washington, which was never a book to me, it was just a notion of what would happen if George appeared. And that came back to me, and I started to think, why don't I make him appear?
Yeah.
So this is my first work of fiction.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I think very often writers do start with sort of journaling like you did and sort of little minor memoir stuff, and it turns into a novel. We have time for one last question. And someone asked, this sort of segues into what you were saying. Are you working on another book? If so, what?
I am working on another book. I'm not working very hard on it because I'm working on marketing this book, but I have a notion for a book about FDR, another presidential alternate history. In 1933, in February, after being elected, but before his first inauguration, FDR was the target of an assassin who blasted away at a political rally in Miami and ended up killing the mayor of Chicago and several bystanders. But Roosevelt was unhurt, and so the idea is what would have happened in the history of the world if FDR had never been sworn in? Who was that vice president elect who would have been president instead? How much would he have known about FDR's plans for the country, and what would the Depression have been like without FDR's leadership and all those programs? What would World War II have been like? I mean, the man occupied the center of the world for 12 years and led to great changes. So it's another kind of what if book.
Well, we will look forward to that, and good luck with it. I want to thank
you.
everyone for joining us this evening.
Thanks so
Special
much
thanks
for
to
coming.
Matthew Felix for orchestrating and facilitating this entire conversation. Really appreciate that. And again, if you've not read this, I encourage you to do so. Pick up a copy. You won't be disappointed. And special thanks, of course, to our special guest, Bill Zarchy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really
Cheryl.
appreciate everyone supporting our events here at Sausalito Books by the Bay. And if you haven't been by to see us, come visit us. We're right on the waterfront in Sausalito. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Matthew.
All right. Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night. Take care.
Good night.
Good night.